how the blood moon was interpreted in the time of Jesus, without science or understanding. The sky was on fire, and no one knew why. Not in the way we mean today, with telescopes and orbital charts and apps that tell you exactly when the next lunar eclipse will occur. In the world of first-century Judea, when the moon turned the color of dried blood and hung over the hills like a wound in the fabric of the night, there were no explanations waiting in books, no reassuring voices on the radio, no scientists to tell the crowd gathered in the courtyard. Don't worry, the Earth's shadow does this every few decades. There was only the moon, enormous, trembling in its redness, impossibly wrong, and the silence of people who believed that what happened in the sky was a direct message from the God who created it. But here's what most modern readers miss entirely. The fear wasn't superstition. It wasn't ignorance in the dismissive sense we use today. It was the entirely rational response of people who lived inside a theological framework where the heavens were not a mechanical system but a living communication. The question was never what is happening astronomically. The question was always, what does God mean by this? And that question, urgent, terrifying, and completely sincere, shaped everything about how people in Jesus' time experienced a blood moon. It shaped what they did with their bodies, what they said to their children, how they prayed, whether they slept or stayed awake staring upward, and what they feared was coming next. If you stay until the end of this, you will never read the apocalyptic passages of the Gospels the same way again. When Jesus speaks of signs in the heavens, of the moon turning to blood, of people fainting from fear at what is coming upon the world, he is not speaking in poetic abstraction. He is speaking a language that every person listening to him already understood in their bones. And if we don't understand what that language felt like from the inside, we lose half of what he was saying. If this kind of deep historical reconstruction strengthens your faith and changes how you read Scripture, consider subscribing to this channel, because this is exactly what we do here, every time. Now, let us go back. The village is small, built into the limestone hillside the way almost every village in Galilee was built. Not because the location was beautiful, but because the stone was there to build with, and the slope offered drainage in the winter rains. The houses are low, flat-roofed, packed together so closely that you can hear your neighbors breathing through the shared wall. The rooftops are not wasted space. In warm months, families sleep there, dry grain there, lay out figs there. The roof is part of the house in a way that the modern mind struggles to picture. On an ordinary night, the village is not fully dark. There are no torches burning through the night. Oil is expensive, and no one wastes it on darkness. But the moon, when it is full, gives enough light to see the outlines of the world, enough light to walk without tripping, enough light to see the face of the person beside you. The full moon, in the ancient agricultural calendar, was not just a celestial event. It was functional. It extended the working day. It allowed travel. It was, in the most literal sense, a gift, which is exactly why its transformation into something red and wrong was so violently disorienting. The change happens gradually, and people outside on that warm spring night would notice it first as a dimming, a slow reduction of that familiar silver light, as if someone were drawing a veil across the moon's face. Then the color begins, first a gray, then a brownish shadow creeping from one edge, then, at totality, that deep, unsettling crimson that gives the phenomenon its ancient name, the color of blood, the color of rust on iron, the color of water when the soil runs into the river after a hard rain, which was itself, in the Exodus tradition, associated with judgment and plague. The people standing on their rooftops on a night like this would have no frame of reference that allowed them to say, "This is normal." They had likely never seen it before. Even if an elder in the village had seen it once, 40 or 50 years earlier, there was no written record they could consult to confirm it was survivable, predictable, or safe. What they had instead were texts. The scrolls read aloud in the synagogue every Sabbath were full of sky language. Joel, the prophet, whose words would become central to the earliest Christian preaching, had written with shattering clarity, "The sun will be turned to darkness, and the moon to blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes." These were not old words that had faded into decoration. In first-century Judea, in a world under Roman occupation, in a world charged with apocalyptic expectation, these words were living. They were felt as imminent. Every generation since the Babylonian exile had wondered, is this the moment? Is this the day the prophet meant? A blood moon did not require interpretation. It arrived with its own ancient caption already written. And so the response was not to sit quietly and observe. The response was to wake the children, to call out to the neighbors, to gather in the courtyard and look together at the sky, and to pray, or to argue about what it meant, which in that world was also a form of prayer. Some would say it meant war was coming. Others would say it announced the death of a king. Others, steeped in the tradition of Babylon, would speak of the moon god's wounding and what that meant for the nations. Others still would simply weep, holding their smallest children tightly, because the most honest response to an event that large and that unexplained was grief, preemptive grief, offered to God as if the catastrophe had already arrived. No one went back to sleep. To understand what a blood moon meant to the people of first-century Judea, you have to first understand what the sky meant to them at all, not philosophically, but practically, intimately, in the texture of every single day. The sky was a calendar. It was a clock. It was a theological document written in light and shadow and repeated with absolute regularity for thousands of years, until the night it wasn't regular anymore. The month began with the new moon, not as a figure of speech, but as an observable event that religious authorities in Jerusalem confirmed by witness testimony. Two reliable men had to appear before the Sanhedrin and report that they had seen the first sliver of the new crescent moon with their own eyes. Only after their testimony was accepted and verified did the official beginning of the month begin. And only then could the calendar of feasts, sacrifices, and obligations proceed. The moon was not background, it was infrastructure. The Sabbath was weekly, but the great feasts were lunar. Passover fell on the 14th of Nisan, always a full moon, because the 14th day of a lunar month is when the moon reaches fullness. This was not coincidence. The full moon at Passover meant that pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem could walk through the night and still see the road. It meant the city was bathed in silver light as tens of thousands of people arrived from every direction, carrying their lambs, singing the Hallel psalms up the Mount of Olives. The full moon was woven into the architecture of the most sacred moment of the Jewish year, which means that a blood moon at Passover was not just frightening in a general way. It was specifically, precisely, liturgically terrifying. The moon that was supposed to illuminate the holy journey, the moon that was structurally part of the night of liberation and memory and covenant, had turned to blood. On the very night when Israel remembered being saved from Egypt. On the very night when the blood of the Lamb had been painted on doorposts so the destroyer would pass over. The symbolism was not subtle. In a world that read meaning into the alignment of events, a blood moon at Passover was a sentence written in the sky by the hand that created both the sky and the feast. And this is the world Jesus moved through. He did not move through it as a detached philosopher, speaking in abstract spiritual principles to people who happened to be wearing tunics. He moved through it as a first-century Jewish man who had grown up reading the same scrolls, celebrating the same feasts, standing under the same sky. When he climbed the Mount of Olives and looked out over the Kidron Valley toward Jerusalem, that city of white limestone and gold temple, and smoke rising from the altar, he was looking at the same Jerusalem that every Passover pilgrim was looking at under the same moon, inside the same expectation. His words about the end of the age, recorded in what scholars call the Olivet Discourse, were not delivered to people who needed the concept of cosmic signs explained to them. They were delivered to people who were already fluent in the language of cosmic signs, who had grown up hearing Joel and Isaiah and Daniel read aloud, who had perhaps already stood on a rooftop on a night when the moon turned red and felt their hearts collapse inward with the question they had no power to answer. Is this it? When Jesus says, in Luke 21, that there will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and on the earth distress of nations in perplexity. The Greek word for perplexity there is aporia, which means a complete absence of any path forward, a total inability to find a way through. It is the word you use when you have run out of every possible response and are simply standing in the middle of what is happening to you, unable to move. That is the word he chooses. Not fear, not confusion, but the specific condition of a person who has exhausted every option and found nothing. He knew what that felt like to his listeners. He was describing something they recognized. But let us step back further, into the daily texture of the world, because the blood moon cannot be separated from the daily relationship these people had with uncertainty. Life in first-century Galilee was not uniformly desperate, but it was structurally fragile in ways that are difficult for modern Western people to fully absorb. The margin between adequacy and crisis was narrow, and the mechanisms for managing risk were almost entirely communal and religious. There were no insurance systems, no emergency relief organizations, no state safety nets in any modern sense. When the harvest failed, families ate less. When a man died young, his widow and children depended entirely on the willingness of relatives and neighbors to absorb them. When disease moved through a village, there was nothing to do but pray, isolate those most severely affected, and wait. In this world, reading signs was not a hobby or a superstition. It was a survival technology. Farmers read the sky for weather. Shepherds read the behavior of animals for predator presence. Fishermen on the Sea of Galilee read the color of the water and the direction of the wind with the precision of professionals whose lives depended on their accuracy. Because their lives did depend on their accuracy. The northern wind coming down from Mount Hermon could turn the lake violent in less than an hour. A boat caught in the wrong position when that wind arrived was in serious trouble. Reading the natural world was not passive observation. It was active, skilled, high-stakes interpretation. And the sky was the most legible surface of all. The stars rose and set with such regularity that navigators could use them across open water. The seasons followed the sun with absolute reliability. The moon cycled through its phases with a predictability so precise that the entire religious calendar was built on it. The sky, in other words, was the most ordered, most trustworthy, most consistent thing in a world where very little else was guaranteed. Which is precisely why its disorder. A moon that turned to blood, a sun that darkened at midday, carried such shattering psychological weight. It was not just frightening because it was unusual. It was frightening because it violated the one system that had never, in living memory, violated anyone. When the most reliable thing in your world becomes unreliable, you do not simply feel afraid. You feel that the ground beneath every assumption you have ever made has shifted. The terror is not proportional to the event. It is proportional to what the event represents. The possibility that order itself is ending. And this is what Jesus understood when he spoke of those signs. He was not predicting unusual weather. He was describing the moment when the most foundational certainties of human experience, the rising of the sun, the cycling of the moon, the ordering of the seasons, would themselves become unstable. The moment when even the sky could not be trusted. He was describing, in the language his listeners already knew, the experience of absolute groundlessness. And he was telling them, in that same conversation, not to be destroyed by it. There was a man in the village. There was always a man like this in every village, who knew the old stories better than anyone else. Not a priest, not a scribe, not a Pharisee with formal training in the academies of Jerusalem. Just an elder, a grandfather type, someone who had lived long enough to have heard things from people who had lived long enough to have heard things from people before them. In a world without widespread literacy, this was how knowledge survived. Not in libraries, but in mouths, in memory, in the slow, patient transfer of story from one generation to the next, around the same fire, under the same sky. On a night when the moon turned red, this was the man people went to find. He would not have had a scientific answer, but he would have had a storehouse of interpretive frameworks, ways of holding the event inside a larger narrative, so that it did not simply dissolve into raw, structureless terror. He would have remembered what his own grandfather had said about a similar night, decades ago. He would have recalled which passage from which prophet seemed most directly applicable. He would have known the Babylonian traditions that had filtered into Jewish consciousness during the exile, the Hellenistic astrological ideas that had been circulating since Alexander's armies passed through the region 3 centuries earlier, and the purely Israelite tradition that ran through Amos and Joel and Ezekiel like a river. He would have offered, not certainty, but context. And in that world, context was almost as valuable as certainty. This is worth pausing over, because it tells us something important about how meaning was made in the ancient world, and about the environment in which Jesus taught. Interpretation was communal. It was not done alone in private by consulting a personal library. It was done together, out loud, in the courtyard or the synagogue or the doorway of someone's house, with people arguing and remembering and correcting each other and appealing to authority and challenging the appeal and starting again. The text was never just a text. It was always already embedded in a tradition of reading, a community of practice, a living argument that had been going on for generations and would continue after everyone present was dead. When Jesus stood up in the synagogue in Nazareth and read from the scroll of Isaiah, and then sat down and said, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing," he was inserting himself into that living argument. He was not delivering a theological paper. He was making a claim inside a conversation that the entire community had been having for centuries about what the prophets meant, about when the things they described would arrive, about who would recognize the moment when it came. The blood moon was part of that conversation. The specific traditions surrounding lunar omens in the ancient Near East were rich, layered, and extremely old. In Mesopotamia, the cultural world that had shaped Jewish consciousness through the Babylonian exile more deeply than many modern readers appreciate, the moon was not simply a light in the sky. It was the body of the moon god Sin, and its behavior communicated directly about the condition of kings, kingdoms, and the cosmic order. A lunar eclipse was understood as an attack on the moon god by demonic forces, and elaborate rituals existed to protect the king during such a period. Because if the moon god was under attack, the king, as the moon god's representative on Earth, was in mortal danger. A substitute king would sometimes be installed for the duration of the eclipse, a commoner who would bear whatever curse was directed at the throne and then be removed or killed once the crisis passed. This tradition had not simply evaporated by the 1st century. Ideas do not evaporate. They transform, they migrate, they merge with other ideas. They survive in fragments inside the consciousness of people who would not recognize their Babylonian origin. The association between a blood moon and the death of a king, or a great man, or a powerful figure, was present in the interpretive vocabulary of 1st century Judea in ways that are visible in the historical record. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing in the late 1st century, records celestial signs in connection with the fall of Jerusalem as if this is the obvious and natural way to tell that story. A comet hung over the city for a year. A light shone around the altar at night. A cow in the temple courts gave birth to a lamb. These were not inserted as superstition. They were inserted as evidence, as part of the argument that the catastrophe was cosmically announced, that the signs were given, that the warning was clear for those who had eyes to read it. The sky was legible. The question was always whether you were literate enough to read it correctly. And here is where the tension of 1st century Judea becomes almost unbearable to contemplate from the outside. Because there were multiple competing systems of interpretation, and they did not agree, the Pharisees, rigorously focused on Torah observance and synagogue life, were generally cautious about astrology. It smelled too much of the nations, too much of Babylon, too much of the world they were supposed to be distinct from. And yet, the same Pharisees read the same prophets who had written in the language of cosmic signs. They could not simply ignore Joel. They had to do something with Joel. And what they did, largely, was defer. Trust that God would make the meaning clear when the time came, and in the meantime, keep the commandments. The Essenes, gathered in their communities near the Dead Sea, had elaborate calendrical systems based on the movements of the sun and moon. They believed they were living in the final age, that the war between light and darkness was approaching its climax, and that the signs in the sky were coordinates in a map they had already partially deciphered. A blood moon for an Essene was not just frightening, it was confirming. It fit the pattern they had been tracking for decades. The Zealots, burning with the conviction that armed resistance to Rome was both a political and a theological obligation, read cosmic signs through the lens of imminent divine intervention. A blood moon meant the moment was near. It meant God was about to act. It meant the time for waiting was over. And the ordinary people, the farmers and fishermen and craftsmen and women grinding grain before dawn, held all of these frameworks simultaneously, imperfectly, in the way that ordinary people have always held theology. Not as a systematic philosophy, but as a set of stories, fears, hopes, and half-remembered phrases that rose to the surface in moments of crisis and tried, imperfectly, to make the crisis bearable. Jesus moved through all of these worlds. He argued with the Pharisees, which means he knew their arguments well enough to engage them at depth. He was sought out by people from every social layer, which means he understood the texture of ordinary fear. He spoke of the signs of the times in a way that resonated with the apocalyptic urgency his listeners already carried. But he redirected that urgency in a direction none of the competing frameworks had anticipated. He did not say, "Decode the signs and you will know the hour." He said, "You do not know the day or the hour." In a world where every school of interpretation was offering a map, he refused to hand out a map. Instead, he told stories about people who were not prepared, about people who fell asleep, about people who assumed there was more time than there was. And he told stories about people who were ready, not because they had decoded the schedule, but because they had been living faithfully in the present moment, tending what they were given to tend, whether or not the sky above them was silver or red or dark. This was not a retreat from the cosmic. It was a reorientation of it. The blood moon was real. The fear it produced was legitimate. The prophetic tradition that connected it to divine communication was not being dismissed. But the response Jesus called for was not calculation. It was character. Not reading the signs correctly, but being the kind of person who would be ready, regardless of which signs appeared or when. That was a harder teaching than any of the alternatives. It asked more. It offered less in the way of control. And it was spoken by a man standing under the same sky, looking at the same moon, who understood from the inside what it cost to surrender the need to know. There is a moment recorded in the Gospels that most readers pass through quickly, because it seems like a detail, a piece of atmospheric background, a note of timing that the narrator includes for chronological clarity. But once you understand the world we have been describing, it stops being a detail entirely. Jesus was crucified at Passover, not near Passover, not around the general season of spring. At Passover, on the very days when Jerusalem was swollen with pilgrims from every corner of the diaspora, when the temple courts were thick with the smell of burnt offerings and the sound of the Levitical choir, when every family and every courtyard in the city was gathered around a table remembering the night in Egypt, when blood on the doorpost meant the destroyer passed over and the firstborn lived, and the moon, on the night of Passover, was full. This is not incidental. This is the entire frame. The Passover full moon was the most theologically loaded moon in the Jewish calendar. It was the moon under which Israel had been born as a people, the moon that had witnessed the first act of divine liberation, the moon whose light had illuminated the road out of Egypt and into the wilderness and eventually into the Promised Land. Every Passover moon carried that memory. Every Passover moon was, for a first-century Jewish person standing in Jerusalem, a moon heavy with the weight of everything God had done, and everything God had promised still to do. Now consider what the Gospel of Luke records about the hours of the crucifixion. From the 6th hour, noon, when the Passover sun should have been at its highest and brightest, darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour. 3 hours of inexplicable darkness, in the middle of the day, during the most sacred feast of the year. Luke is not offering a meteorological explanation. He is not suggesting cloud cover. He is placing this darkness inside the same prophetic tradition we have been tracing throughout this entire narrative. The tradition of Joel, of Amos, of the signs in the sun and the moon that announced the day of the Lord. The early followers of Jesus, who were trying to make sense of what had happened on that hill outside Jerusalem, did not have to search far for a framework. The framework was already written. The sun had darkened. The prophet had said the sun would darken. The moon, that Passover moon, had a tradition of blood already embedded in its most ancient associations. And the man on the cross, the man whose blood was literally being poured out on the ground below him, had himself, in his last public teaching on the Mount of Olives overlooking that same city, spoken of exactly these signs as the announcement of something the world had never seen before. The earliest Christian preaching, as recorded in the Acts of the Apostles, reaches immediately for Joel. Peter, standing in Jerusalem 50 days after the crucifixion, on the day of Pentecost, in front of a crowd of Jewish pilgrims from across the known world, opens his mouth and quotes, "This is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. I will show wonders in the heavens above, and signs on the earth below, blood and fire, and billowing smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness, and the moon to blood, before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord." He was not quoting Joel as a proof text selected from a database of useful scriptures. He was quoting Joel because everyone standing in that courtyard had just lived through the events Joel described. They had been there, or they knew people who had been there, or they had heard the accounts from those who had stood on the hills outside Jerusalem and watched the sky go wrong at noon on a Passover Friday. Joel was not prophecy being applied retrospectively to fit a narrative. Joel was the language that was already in everyone's mind when the darkness fell. And Peter was saying, with the full force of a man who believed it completely, "You already know what this language means. You have known since childhood. This is it. This is the day the prophet saw." But there is something deeper still, and it requires sitting with the first-century mind for just a moment longer. In the ancient world, a blood moon was associated, above all else, with the death of a king. We trace this association back to Babylon, to the rituals surrounding the moon god and the protection of the throne. But the association had survived, in various forms, into the wider Hellenistic and Roman world. Celestial signs at the death of great men were recorded and expected. When Julius Caesar was assassinated, ancient sources described the sun veiling its face for an entire year. The association between cosmic disorder and the death of a powerful figure was not a Jewish peculiarity. It was a nearly universal interpretive reflex in the ancient Mediterranean world. Jesus died under that sky, and the claim his followers were making, the claim that got them killed, that turned the Roman world upside down, that eventually restructured the calendar of Western civilization, was that this particular death was not the end of his power, but the fullest expression of it. That the king whose death the cosmos had announced was not diminished by the announcement, but vindicated by what came after it. The blood moon tradition said, "When the sky bleeds, a king has fallen." The resurrection tradition said, "This king did not stay fallen." These were not two separate theological claims. They were one claim, spoken in the only language the ancient world had for events of that magnitude, the language of sky and blood and darkness and light returning. There is a kind of knowledge that comes not from explanation, but from standing inside something long enough to feel its weight. The people who watched the moon turn red over the hills of Galilee, who lay awake in their courtyards with their children pressed close, who whispered the words of Joel into the darkness because they had no other words for what they were seeing. They were not primitive. They were not ignorant in any way that diminishes them. They were human beings encountering the limits of what any human being can know, and responding to those limits with the only tools available: memory, community, faith, and the willingness to keep asking what it meant even when no answer came. Jesus was one of them. He had stood under that sky. He had heard those words read aloud in the synagogue since childhood. He had felt the particular weight of a Passover moon and understood, from the inside, what it meant to a people who had been waiting for centuries for the day the prophets had promised. When he spoke of the signs in the heavens, he was not delivering a lecture about eschatology. He was speaking to people whose hearts already knew the vocabulary, whose bodies already knew the fear, whose faith was already stretched across the gap between what they had been promised and what they were still waiting to receive. And he was telling them, not with false comfort, not with a timetable, not with a code to be cracked, that the one who made the moon was not absent from the night it turned to blood, that the darkness was not the final word, that the God who had spoken through the sky and fire and cloud and trembling light since the beginning was still speaking, and that the message, when finally and fully understood, was not destruction. It was the oldest promise, written in light. "I am here. Do not be afraid." The blood moon hung over a world that had no science to explain it, no technology to predict it, no system to make it safe. And in that world, a man stood on a hillside and taught people not how to decode the sky, but how to live faithfully beneath it, with open hands, with wakeful hearts, with the kind of trust that does not require the reassurance of certainty before it can take the next step. That teaching did not come from a library or a classroom. It came from a life lived under the same uncontrollable sky as everyone else, and from the conviction, held without flinching, that the sky and everything beneath it was held by something that would not let it fall.